Good morning. It looks like there's a really wide-eyed group of people here this morning. I actually moved back to the West Coast, so I'm kind of on a 3-hour time difference. So if I look even more red-eyed than a lot of people here, you'll have to excuse me for that. So we just introduced Molly, as you saw. I'm Devon. What I want to do first is to welcome you to the OLC Collaborate in Kansas City. And special thanks to our academic partner today, which is the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and also the University of Missouri System. So without these kinds of support from organizations like the University of Missouri System and PSI and Canvas, we really couldn't have these kinds of events at Collaborate. So the sponsorship of these events is extremely important, and I hope that if you have a chance, you can kind of thank anybody who's here from the sponsoring organization. So one of the things that people have asked me is that, that there's a couple of things. What is OLC? What is the Online Learning Consortium? And what I want to do is to be able to kind of say that it's really a community of practitioners who are involved in online education. And what I should also say, it's not just online education, it's kind of all education. It's digital learning. It's kind of broadened its kind of scope from just being online to, in fact, saying, education is more about the learning than about the techniques or the styles in which people learn. And so we were very kind of interested in kind of the whole concept of learning in general and kind of specifically with the digital environment. And so one of the things that you'll find is we have all kinds of opportunities for professional development, such as these kinds of collaborates. I hope how many of you have gone to an OLC conference, a national conference? If you're like me, the first time I went to one of those conferences, my mind went poof like this, because I said, this is really a remarkable thing that's happening, and there are people just like me who are engaged and are really into the digital environment. So I think that this is something that's very important, that we get together as a community. That said, what does it mean to be a community? So I don't know if many of you knew this, but the very original, the very first Collaborate actually occurred here in Kansas City back in 2015. So we were the first ones to be able to host and to be able to work with OLC to be able to kind of host a Collaborate. So a Collaborate concept came out of the idea of a Chautauqua. Do people here know what a Chautauqua was, or they've heard of it? So a couple of you have heard of it. But back in the turn of the century, what happened was they had these kinds of great issues of the time. And again, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have cell phones, they didn't have these kinds of things. But what they did is had basically traveling, events. And so basically these organizations would pull together the speakers of the time or the great thinkers, and they would travel from city to city to city. And they would put up these tents, and they would say, come one, come all, let's talk about the issues, whether it's evolution, whether it's about religion, whether it's about, whatever the topic of the day was. And they would engage these communities across the country in kind of the discussions about what was going on. And so the collaborates are actually kind of modeled after that type of activity. And so this is what we hope it is. So the collaborates really are an opportunity for an open and civil discussion about things that we're all interested in. We don't necessarily all agree about, but we can certainly kind of come together as a group of educators and say, what are the best approaches that we can take, and what are the things we need to do to understand what's happening in higher ed today and kind of in our institutions in general in the bigger context of the world. So I think that these collaborates are an extremely important event. And also, what we also believe is that, as Nelson Mandela said, that education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And I think that this is really, in my mind, this is the heart and soul of what OLC is all about. It's saying that we have to build a community in order to kind of change the world. And we do it kind of one city, one person, one institution at a time. So again, if you haven't been a member of the OLC, I would really strongly encourage you to kind of look and see what the membership has and what we can be able to do with that. So with that, I'm going to kind of start the day. We have an exciting lineup today of people who are going to talk. And what I should say is that collaborates are a little bit different than what you have. What we're going to do is actually start off the day with a panel, and we'll be able to show you a video, and we will kind of go into the discussions. During these kinds of days, each person will then have a chance to kind of give a mini keynote talk, and what happens is that'll be about 45 minutes. Then what happens is we have a breakout, so they have a number of rooms, and you can look at your schedule and you can kind of see that there's various topics. Feel free to walk into any room and kind of join the conversation that's occurring there. Each room will have a scribe and a moderator so that they'll be able to kind of help the discussion move. So everything will also be kind of tracked down and recorded so that after the conference, you can be able to kind of see and go back and look and see what the discussions were about. You can kind of look, if you couldn't attend one of the other discussions, you can kind of see what the people were talking about in that discussion. And I think what you'll find, it's a very engaging way to kind of get the bigger picture of what's going on in the world. So there's a few other things. There will be lunch here. It'll be in this room. There'll be coffee and various snacks throughout the day. You can kind of feel free to help yourself. We do encourage you, if you're kind of saying, hey, I've seen this person here, I haven't seen him in a few months, feel free to sit down and talk to him. Part of this is to be able to be engaged and to talk to each other and not for the speakers to talk at you. So this is kind of one of the things we'd like to be able to do. So with that, what I'd like to do is invite the panel up here, and also Tori. She's here. Oh, one thing while they're coming up to the counter, what I'd like to say is that there are a number of sponsors that are back at the back room there, and what we would like to be able to do is feel free to go to them and get a ticket for a drawing, and at the end of the day, what we will be able to do is pick one or two winners who will receive conference on-site registrations for the OLC conferences. You have to be here to win, and the winners will be announced at the closing arguments, I feel like I'm in law school. And I never went to law school, so that's a really horrible thing. And also, for those of you who are really into social networking, if you use the hashtag OLC Collaborate, we'll pick one winner who's been posted on that and give them a $25 gift certificate. So real briefly, I mean, I think Kansas City is real lucky in one aspect, because Jennifer Mathis, who is somewhere in the room, is she here? Can you stand up or raise your hand? Or she's not in the room. She is here, okay? She is Online Learning Consortium's Chief Strategy Officer, and what you can do is she lives in Kansas City. And so this is a really great opportunity for those of you in the Kansas City area to be able to kind of, you know, if you wanted to come to your school, if you wanted to come and talk, or if you wanted to come and just kind of say, hey, what can we do with your institution as an institution? She's right down the street. Well, half an hour down the street. But she is in Kansas City, so I would encourage you to kind of talk to her a little bit about what's going on. So with that, what we're going to do, I'm just going to give a really brief introduction. As Molly said, you know, a few years ago we started to delve into at UMKC. I'm putting on my UMKC hat now. And one of the things that happened was one of our instructional designers showed me this. I don't want to call it a cartoon because it kind of lessens it in my mind, but kind of this image of kind of what accessibility was all about. And I have to say, in my many, many years of being in education, I think this is the one image that actually impacted me, probably one of the most that I've ever seen. Because what I started to realize is that there's an incredible wealth of information in this slide. And what I also realized is that, like a lot of institutions, we were struggling with what is accessibility, what does it mean? Do we have to close caption everything? Do we have to do all this kind of stuff? It's going to cost us a lot of money. But when I started to look at this and I started to realize how we operate as an institution, one of the things that happened was that you start to look at this image and you say, well, there's not really a lot of high-tech stuff there. There's really, you know, a ramp, there's some stairs, there's the regular process of cleaning the stairs, there's people waiting to use the services. It's really a matter of changing the way you work and not necessarily incorporating lots and lots of new technologies that may not even exist at this point. So what I would encourage you through the day is to kind of think about this image and think about accessibility and think about what this means. And with our panelists, you know, kind of take the opportunity to talk to them because they're all experts in this area and they can all give you great advice on terms of what's going on. So that said, what I would like to do is kind of start the panel off. And what we're going to do, we're going to try this, and we'll see if it works, is we're going to actually show a short video. What we would like to do is give you a perspective of what it's like to be a student with disabilities, and kind of what is it like to have a student aspect of this, and kind of, you know, how we should kind of start framing the day's discussion. So if I have this right, we should be able to start this. And so what we had is a student named Aaron Price, and I'm just going to let him do the talking right now. And what I should also say is Tori Wynn, who is the third person over here, was actually the one who worked with the student and got the videos together. So she's going to be able to provide insights in terms of more discussions in terms of what's kind of happened with that and how the interviews went, and maybe some insights into what they were talking about that may not be reflected in this kind of discussion. Of course, that's not the mouse. So with that, let's go.
UMKC Online, an interview with Aaron Price. My name is Aaron Price, and my major is urban studies.
Why did you choose this major?
Well, originally I wanted to do urban planning and design, but I can't really do that because it requires a lot of hands-on activities like freehand drawing or building models, and I can't really do either of those things because I can't use my hands. But urban studies was the next best thing to urban planning and design.
What would you like to do professionally after you graduate from UMKC?
Professionally, I'm kind of looking to use it as a stepping stone for a law degree.
What assistive technologies do you use in your online and face to face courses?
The assistive technologies that I use when I'm using a computer at home are drag and naturally dictate. Um, I also use a trackball mouse with 4 different buttons that allows me to program the buttons to do different functions like click and drag, double click, refresh, things of that sort. I also have, I guess it's a document reader program. Um, it'll read whatever's on the document aloud to me. I also uh, have a mount on my chair for to mount a laptop, so I can have a laptop right in front of me.
What are some of the advantages?
So why don't we stop it right there? So one of the things that I'd like the panel to do is maybe kind of discuss, at least kind of the things. The thing that amazed me when I first saw this video was the student saying, I really wanted to be this type of urban planner. And then what they said is, I couldn't do that because I couldn't use my hands. And I started thinking about that a lot and started to think, well, is that an issue with the department as well? Is there something that the department itself can actually be doing? What is an urban planner? What makes up an urban planner? An example I want to give you is being a nurse. Oftentimes we hear, well, you can't be a nurse if you can't see. But then I thought about, well, how many of us have actually called on the phone, when we look at the back of our insurance cards and say, you need to call this number before you go see a doctor, and you actually get a nurse, and you describe your symptoms, and you describe what's happening to you. That person is a nurse. And again, you may argue about the training of them, but maybe we need to think about what it takes to become a nurse or what it takes to become an urban planner. So with that, I'm just going to kind of turn it over to the panel and maybe let them give some insights into what they might think about, those kinds of questions. Yeah? Is that on?
Talk loud.
How about this one?
I can just talk loud. How about that?
How about this one?
Oh,
I don't sound like a radio announcer?
I think it's going through the.
Oh.
I'll just talk loud. Um, so I absolutely agree with what Devon's saying here. It's remarkable to think that someone who had a desire to work in a certain field would think that they can't do that. Actually, we were we were at dinner last night talking about this particular thing. The barrier for that student was the AutoCAD, and yet today there is no barrier with that student being able to draw out cities and plans and stuff using technology. So it makes me wonder, is there just a lack of information sharing between individuals with disabilities and the systems that are there to serve them and to help piece these things together? That's the very first thing I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of it comes down to, have the students been prepared and what they've been told going into their college experience about what's possible and what's not possible. I think technology has evolved in such a way that, we look at ways that we can do multiple inputs into a system. So thinking about having to use a traditional mouse in a click type situation isn't the same as what it might have been 10, 15, 20 years ago. There are more options now, but it takes some creativity. And it also depends on how familiar the folks who have been trained in disability services are with how that technology works. I think one thing that Cindy and I talk about frequently is that she and I both are disability services professionals who have been immersed in technology technology because of where we've worked over the years. And so we have more comfort with technology than some of our colleagues in disability services will have in terms of how to, to make that happen. And that becomes, a real challenge because technology is big, it's awful, it's scary when you don't know how to use it. And when you're the person who has to advise a student on how to use it, sometimes that student's options become limited more than they should become limited. And I'd love to talk with Aaron and say, why did you make that decision? Who did you talk to? Is that something that happened while you were in high school? Because the high school, in my experience is that they are even, yeah, it's on. They're even, less familiar with some of the ways in which technology will work than than what some of the college providers are. And so that then becomes, he has in his head as he's going through high school, yes, I want to be an urban planner, but I can't use my hands, so I can't do this. Well, there are ways that we could accommodate that, but sometimes, the students just kind of get, these messages all the way through that no, that's not possible, no, we can't do that, or that's going to be too hard. And it may have been his choice, and that's okay. He's free to make that choice, but I would love to, make sure that he made that choice knowing full well what all of his options were.
And I can actually give a little bit of context to that conversation. So one of the things that you didn't see on the video is that Aaron was talking a little bit about his history as a student. And originally, he actually wanted to go into veterinary science, and that was his original major. But then he had an accident, which ended up causing him to be a quadriplegic, as you see on the video. And he chose urban planning and design initially, then decided that that wasn't going to work because he couldn't use his hands, and then eventually ended on what he is now. So he's actually had quite a few transitions in education, in higher ed specifically, through different majors. So.
And I could just simply say ditto to everything shared. The additional twist or wrinkle I'll offer as well as I was listening to that video, one of the things that immediately comes to my mind are, okay, so what are the standards? What are the requirements? What have we set? But more importantly, what are the critical issues and or big ideas that these individuals like Aaron, would they need to be able to be equipped with to be able to do the work that is actually being asked? And generally, something like an urban plan, I imagine there's a certificate, some sort of professional standard. Oftentimes, I feel, both in K-12 as well as higher education, we don't take that standard and say, yeah, but what's critical? What are the essential ingredients, essential ideas? What does an individual really need to have? Instead, we say, here's the standard, black and white, no flexibility. That cartoon is a perfect example. Well, the stairs, everyone's going to use the stairs, and then there's the ramp. Well, no, let's think of it from a design perspective. Let's think of what we're really trying to accomplish, and from that, potentially redesign. Now, technology can certainly help us with that access, but also if we redesign to those big ideas, we may realize access is no longer the issue because some of the things we said were essential really aren't essential. They're great for enrichment, wonderful to have, but they aren't the primary critical things that Aaron and others are going to need to have. So.
Well, can I ask the panel one question on that? Because I think, you brought it up, Sean. This goes back, the arguments or the discussions we have oftentimes with faculty is, what is the learning outcome? What is the learning objective? And certainly when you do it at a course level, you have a lot of difficulties. But what I found as a vice provost is oftentimes the departments or the curriculum, they don't have outcomes. And they kind of say, well, it's because we're history people or whatever. So how do you think that the outcomes, if faculty or departments actually sat down and started thinking more deeply about what the learning outcomes would be, do you think they'd redesign their curriculum a little bit to kind of start saying, hey, here's how maybe we can have a ramp and a stairs?
Well, sure. I think it's a phenomenal opportunity. I think truly if we were to push in higher education to really think about what are our objectives and outcomes, first of all, we could do this within a course because oftentimes what we find is what we actually would say are essential and big ideas, and we take a look at what we actually assess for, and then what we instruct for, they don't align. It's time spent, and honestly, I think in online learning, one of the benefits of online learning is we tend to be a little bit more centered in that when actually we redesign our course and think about this is the path we want the students to take in the journey, we tend to make it a bit briefer, a bit narrower, because we were like, well, wait a minute here, this additional stuff we did face-to-face, that's not relevant to what we actually want to assess. Oh, then maybe I can take that off the table. So sadly, I don't think we do that enough in higher education, or in K-12 for that matter, and that's an excellent exercise. Oftentimes I find in places where we have professional standards and or some sort of like in engineering, we have a certificate at the end, those conversations tend to take place more aligned because of the fact that we have something that we're trying to address versus, let's say, history and English, where there's a lot more flexibility, let's say.
One thing that I would add to that is that, for me, I always find it rather amusing that when I go to some of my academic colleagues, because we have a student who's made an accommodation request, University of Phoenix has an institutional learning goal that our students are going to work collaboratively and as part of learning teams. And so one of our most popular accommodation requests is for students to ask to do a learning team of one, because God forbid they have to work with people. Which, I mean, how many of us in this room absolutely hate group work? I will raise my hand loud and proud. I hate group work in academic courses, but I get why we do it. And, we'll go, our disability services staff will go to our academic colleagues and say, okay, is this an essential element of the course? And, look at it, so let's talk about the learning objectives and whether or not this is a reasonable accommodation for this particular student in this particular course. And they look at us like we have four heads, because no one has really ever asked them to talk about whether or not it's an essential element of the course, because it's what we do. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to do that for that particular course. And so it's been an interesting exercise because, and we were talking about this at dinner last night too, most of our academic colleagues have never been taught how to teach. Pedagogy doesn't come into a PhD program, even PhD programs in education, in a lot of times. You're not being taught how to construct, learning objectives. You're not being taught about how to get to those learning outcomes that you have and how to design a course that meets that. What happens when you sit down to teach a course? You think about what your experience has been, and if it was good enough for you, it's good enough for your students, right? So that's kind of the basis from where we come. But for my purposes, when I'm looking at whether or not an accommodation is reasonable, I have to be able to justify denying that accommodation to the student by saying it either reduces a standard, it fundamentally alters the nature of the program or the course, or it poses an undue burden. And how do I get to that? Well, I have to know what that activity, what that course activity is going to lead to in terms of a learning objective and a learning outcome. And so it's been an interesting exercise as we focus as a university too on, really looking at assessment and looking at, learning outcomes and learning objectives and, putting more of that, emphasis on the front end as we're doing some course redesign. And then for us to come in from disability services where folks are like, I thought you just gave people extra time. I mean, you guys do more than that? And it's been a really interesting conversation for us to have, and has, really kind of, looked at what accommodations mean, how they work, and how we're supposed to decide whether or not something's, reasonable. It's just not a willy-nilly kind of, decision. There actually is some quote-unquote science behind it and how we figure that out.
Okay, and what I would do is encourage the audience. If you have questions or if you have comments at any point during the discussion, raise your hand and we'll ask you. Again, this is a collaborate, so the idea is that we're supposed to be having a discussion, and then there's a question way back there.
I don't know off the top of my head. He was having a hard time remembering the name of the mouse and the document reader program, but I can find that out for you guys and send that information to the OLC so that can get out to you as well. Mm-hmm.
So what I'd like to do is, if there's no more, did you have a question? Yeah, okay.
Could you please just repeat the three things that you look at to decide whether or not an accommodation? Sure. So I call these the three musketeers of accommodations. This is what accommodations do not do. They do not fundamentally alter the nature of the program or the course. So if you think about my last institution had gone from print-based correspondence courses to online courses, and I had a student who requested to go back to a print-based correspondence course rather than take an online course. That fundamentally alters the nature of the course or the program, so that was unreasonable. It does not reduce standards. So if the student in a course has to write 7 papers, reflective papers across the course of a semester, an accommodation to reduce the number of those is not going to be approved because it's unreasonable. And it does not pose an undue burden. And so undue burden can mean a number of things, but in this context, it usually means that students are not able to have standing daily appointments with faculty. You know, if they ask for that, we're going to deny that. You know, if they ask for more access to the faculty member in an online course via phone, we will, you know, look at that and, you know, kind of say, okay, within reason in terms of how often, but that might be a reasonable accommodation. So those three things. So it does not fundamentally alter, does not reduce program standards, and does not pose an undue burden.
And I want to just chime in really quickly. Be very careful if any of you are thinking, oh, my stuff fits into that, especially the undue burden piece. Well, an institution may say meeting every day face-to-face with faculty member poses an undue burden. That doesn't mean that that student doesn't have a right to meet with somebody every day. And from a legal standard, showing an undue burden is actually itself an undue burden. The legal structures are such that an entity, a department, or a college, even an institution, is not necessarily what they're looking at as the baseline of what makes an undue burden. So I'm from public ed in Utah. If there was a case of undue burden that came to us, they wouldn't say, well, this is going to cost Utah State University this much money, that's an undue burden. They would look at what is the state system of higher education in Utah, and is that an undue burden? They're not saying, oh, this is going to be a $3,000 captioning piece every 10 weeks in a department. That's an undue burden. That's not the standard. So anyway, I just wanted to get that out.
Sorry, Devon.
You can see these people are very passionate about it, so, that's good.
The one thing I want to add as color to that, to Sadi's, really good caution is, I recently had a meeting with our marketing folks, and we had made a decision to go with a vendor that offered a service on our public website that was not accessible. And we had a meeting with the attorneys and, to try to figure out what our path forward was going to be, because we had already entered into a contract with this vendor, and the vendor was not going to be able to meet our benchmark standard of accessibility, which is the WCAG 2.0 AA, and we'll talk more about that later. But and so our chief marketing officer looks at me and she goes, well, isn't that an undue burden to us? And I go, we made the decision to go with the vendor. We can't then say that our decision to go with a particular vendor makes remediating this issue an undue burden, because we would be laughed out of court. And, so that's something to keep in mind, in terms of when, you look at the undue burden, that is going to be the highest litmus test that you're going to have in terms of saying that an accommodation or an approach to access is not appropriate. So just be, and we can talk more about this throughout the day as well, but, certainly the caution has to be out there. When you're talking about, the various publisher sites, that we want to use, one always comes up with My Math Lab. We were teaching math long before Pearson came up with My Math Lab, or whoever they bought it from. So we can't say that because our curriculum now rests on My Math Lab that it's an undue burden for us to accommodate the student or to find another path of access. Because we made the decision to put that into our course, that's all well and good. We now have the duty to accommodate it.
And I urge us, so as we go along today, dotting the I's and crossing the T's are going to be critical, and understanding what those aspects are, being reinforced about what those aspects are really critical. But I'd challenge us all, if we walk away here saying, okay, I'm more comfortable dotting the I's and crossing the T's, well, first of all, I'll argue, and you'll hear from me in this respect, we're not meeting the needs of all learners that we're accepting into our institutions of higher education. Fact, there's no question about that. So the challenge will be to not only think about crossing the I's and dotting the T's, dotting the I's and crossing the T's, will be also the redesign for all. And in doing so, it's back to that comic about the ramp. In doing so, we'll meet the needs of a variety of learners, including those that we have to meet in terms of accessibility requirements. So I'll challenge us to be thinking about that as we go along.
So
I was just going to say, I know the purpose of this intro is to get us centered on the user experience. And as you can see, we're like, I don't know, horses in the gates here. We're just ready to run. And I want to apologize if we are veering a little bit off course.
That's what it's for.
It's so critical, though, for everybody to be centered in why we're here today. And that's that everything that you guys do affects the real lives of real people. These videos are showing little pieces of that. But let's, regardless of what any of us yabber on about, let's make sure that this time is centering time.
No, that's a great point, and I think that you know, this is kind of a new topic for a lot of people, including me. And as you delve into it, you realize how important the whole topic really is, and how, in some ways, it forms the foundation of what education should be. To think more holistically about both the student and the design of courses. So I think these kinds of discussions are actually very important. So why don't we see what Aaron has to say about his campus experience.
UMKC Online, My Campus Experience. What assistive technologies do you use in your online and face-to-face courses?
So we've kind of seen some of this
The
already.
assistive technologies that I use when I'm using a computer at home are drag and naturally dictate. I also use a trackball mouse with 4 different buttons that allows me to program the buttons to do different functions like click and drag, double click, refresh, things of that sort. I also have, I guess it's a document reader program. It'll read whatever's on the document aloud to me. I also have a mount on my chair to mount a laptop, so I can have a laptop right in front of me.
What are some of the advantages to using the assistive technologies?
Well, the assistive without the assistive technology that I use, like drag and naturally dictate, I basically kind of have to sit and hunt and peck on a keyboard, and that takes a really long time. I also have to take my eyes away from the computer to look down at the keyboard while I'm typing, so I can't actually know if what I'm typing is 100% what needs to be being typed. And then when I look back up at the screen, it could be spelled incorrectly, so then I have to erase it and try it again. But with drag and naturally dictate, I can continuously look at the screen, and I don't have to take the time to push in each individual letter. I can just talk it into a microphone, and it comes out on the computer.
What are the consequences if you do not have this technology?
It takes a really long time for me to accomplish some of the tasks that are required for me to finish when I don't have that kind of technology.
Are there compatibility issues institutions should consider?
The trackball mouse that I use, for some reason, the computer labs aren't compatible with it, or currently aren't compatible with it. It would be nice if we could figure out how to make that work.
UMKC Online, what is accessibility?
Why don't we
digital
stop? You know, one of the things that kind of was interesting to me is that, you know, again, this is the person who I guess has had to keep track of money, is who pays for that?
I wanted to add a little bit more context to that video because I couldn't have you guys sit here for 45 minutes just watching Aaron's interview. But when I asked him about, you know, some of the consequences of he didn't have this assistive technology and some of the compatibility issues that institutions should be aware of, I mean, that opened a huge can of worms, and we talked for a really long time off camera about all of the different aspects to being a student at UMKC, both online and face-to-face, because he takes both classes, and just all of the different compatibility issues that, you know, he's raised with disability services, but it didn't feel like the rest of the institution was paying any attention to his needs. So I just wanted to point that out to you, just to know that there was a lot more to that conversation than just that really small piece there.
That's a good point. We probably shouldn't talk about cost right now, but I think it is one we'll have to come back to. But one of the things I think, Tori, when you know, we were working together, that came up that I was never really aware of was that it's not just your course material, it's what happens across the campus. And so, for example, if a student who's working remotely or online needs financial aid, what is the experience that the student has with the financial aid office? What's the experience the student has with, you know, the registrar's office or being able to register? And so, you know, we can design the most wonderful classes in the world that are, you know, really highly diversified in terms of the tools you can use. But if a student can't register for a course, I mean, is that slowing them down in the progression of their program? So maybe people could talk a little bit about that in terms of the whole, the campus experience.
Yeah, and of course, my passion is looking at all of the systems that are online, everything under a domain name at all, at whatever institution or organization that you come from, and how is that accessible to all. In a lot of ways, Aaron's kind of fortunate, because as long as there can be adaptations made for non-keyboard use, he's doing fine. He can see the screen, he can see the content. That's not true for folks that are blind. He can hear multimedia content. That's not so true for folks that are deaf. And I don't know about this, but he may or may not have cognitive issues that can be exacerbated with certain kinds of instructional designs. But the notion that we need to focus on just the instruction. Now, how many of you guys are faculty or instructors? Okay, how many of you are administrators over programs? Okay, there are a bunch of hands that weren't raised, so I'm not sure I know. Oh, instructional designers. Thank you. There we go. There we go. Okay. But we've got to bust through this, because it really is. It's everything. And if you're online, there still are ways that the campus or the institution will try to connect you with other parts of the campus experience, or I should say the institutional experience. All of this stuff needs to be available to everybody. The bookstore, everything. So don't just think, as we're talking today, just about a class, even though we are talking about online learning here. But when we're talking about web access, it's everything.
Well, I'm going to actually try to, I'm going to answer a question that you asked, but an additional part, just real brief, make sure we all have the foundation. So although, Tori, you mentioned Aaron's had an accident somewhere potentially after high school. So Aaron's a bit unique, but just to let everyone know, most likely individuals coming into higher education, if they're using a technology, most likely they've been using that technology in a K-12 environment. And in that environment, there's lots of different things we can talk about. That's not the point I want to make. It's really critical, though, that as those individuals transition into higher education, that the IHE and the K-12, through the individual's family, the support system, are interacting so that that transition with the technology is done very well. And if done well, it can be very effective, so that individual coming into the IHE, coming into the demand of the IHE, those considerations for the technology they've been using have been reconsidered to make sure that that technology is accessible, the way Aaron mentioned, in terms of labs and things of that nature, as well as still consistent with the demands of what they're about to do. Let's say going from a face-to-face to an online would be one consideration. But done well, those individuals, it can be somewhat seamless. So.
And I think, Sean brings up a good point. I've worked with a lot of students over my career who have transitioned directly from high school into college, and who have a really good transition plan, and they've been connected with our state voc rehab office before they go to college. And for a lot of our students, the technology that our students are using for their personal use come from state voc rehab agencies, because they have the funding to be able to do that. So, if a student needs something to be able to get their homework done, most often, they're going to be working with voc rehab. They're going to purchase it for the student's personal use, and it is our responsibility to look at, campus facilities to make sure that those are accessible. So what do we put in our, campus computer labs? Do we we need to ensure that those are accessible to students as well. Here's the wrinkle that happens with online learning that I don't think a lot of folks realize. Your online courses, I'm venturing to guess based on my experience at various institutions, tend to attract older students who have been out of school for a lot longer, and like Aaron, likely have acquired a disability since their last formal schooling. Those students don't know about voc rehab. And those students also may not qualify for voc rehab support, because voc rehab support, I'm using the shortened verb now when I say voc rehab, but it stands for vocational rehabilitation, which means that there's an assessment done at each one of the state vocational rehabilitation agencies to determine what is, at what level is the student employable. The vocational rehab does not care whether or not the student gets a college degree. They want that student in a job. They call their students their consumers, and their funding is based on whether or not that individual is employed or not, and what level of employment is based on an assessment. So I've worked with a lot of students over the years who come to us because vocational rehab said that they're not going to support college study because they could get a job that would match, their skill set and, with what their disability presents as, and that's not what the student wants. And so therefore there's a conflict then, because the voc rehab is not going to purchase the kind of technology that the student might need, or if the student has been out of school for a while, so, they may have tried, college once before, right out of high school, and then, went out and worked, construction. This is the one that I get most often. They were working in construction. They loved what they were doing. They were working with their hands. They fell off of a ladder, and they can no longer do construction work anymore. And so now it's like, okay, well, maybe now at 35, 36 years old, I'm going to go back to school and I'll get a degree. But I've been out of school for so long, and, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to use accommodations, and I don't have any of the technology that's going to help me, nor do I know how to use it. And so that is one of the bigger challenges I think that we face in our field with students, is that, just like students come into your classrooms on a continuum of terms of how prepared they are for the academic content, students with disabilities are on that same sort of a continuum when it comes to how to use not only the technology, but also self-accommodation strategies, things that they can do to mitigate the impact of the disability in their world to make it so that they can focus on their coursework. And so it becomes really difficult for those of us in disability services to figure out how do we keep splitting this baby in more ways, right? So it had just been we were dealing solely with the accommodations, and then when the students come into your office, you would help them and give them some tips and strategies on how to manage the symptoms of their disability so they could focus on their work. And now for some of our disability services offices that don't have accessibility folks on staff, now you're being asked to consult and talk about, well, what does web accessibility mean? And oh my goodness, I'm one of those disability services providers who thought that just because it was on the web, it had to be accessible. You're telling me it doesn't work that way? There's so much that we have to do that we're trying to kind of make up for some of the gaps that happen across these students' lives. And when you have, the older population of students who tend to flock to online courses because they're managing multiple responsibilities of work and life and children and, caregiving maybe for older parents, and now they have a disability on top of that, it becomes really difficult. And you can totally see why these students just give up and they're like, I'm done. No more. I can't do another thing. So I think that's one of our challenges, to figure out how do you support a student like Aaron, who seems to have really good support, who seems to have, since the time of his accident, learned how to use some of the technology really, really well. But you're going to have students who come to those courses who don't have that, and the technology is not going to save them. And so then what do we do? So that's part of the design that comes into play, is designing for all levels of ability, all level of skill set, all level of comfort and familiarity with technology as well.
All this is really fascinating, quite honestly. I mean, it's things that I hadn't, kind of thought about more deeply, and I think that institutions should. But, that said, and I know one of you are going to be talking about how to change the culture of the institution, but just in general, I mean, again, I keep going back to resources. Should, universities be thinking about incorporating, for example, the disability services offices more into a curriculum, like an academic unit, instead of kind of an external service? Or how would you go about kind of integrating these kinds of things?
I'm taking my place, Cindy, because I have strong feelings on this. I think, yeah, I will tell you how I feel. I'm from New York, guys. I may be in Arizona now, but, bold New Yorker here. I firmly believe that the best alignment for a disability services office is within the academic structure of the university. And here's why. I think I see you're clapping. And here's why. Everything we do touches the student's academic journey at the institution. That analysis that I told you about earlier of how we decide what's reasonable and what's unreasonable, that's an academic analysis. That's us looking at the learning outcomes and the learning objectives. When I come into a meeting with faculty and they know that I report up through the provost's office, there's an automatic, it automatically happens that they listen and they pay attention just a little bit differently. And I don't know what the magic button is there, because I wouldn't say anything differently if I reported up through a VP of student student affairs or student life or whatever it is on your campus. But what folks tend to think is that the VP of student life, student affairs, that division is really, kind of the old and loco parentis, the idea of, taking care of, the students, experience at the institution and making sure they have something to do when they're not in classes, and Greek life and residence life, and it's all the, and I don't like this term, it's not mine, but like the fluff and stuff, that a college, life is made of. It's, it's not the most important thing, which the most important thing is the academics. When you're aligned with an academic, and through reporting up through the provost's office, you have access to conversations that you wouldn't have if you were part of the VP for student affairs, entity, because you do meet more often with department chairs, you meet with the deans, you meet with, the faculty, and you have, different entree points into that conversation, and you get to focus and talk about not only what's important about the student experience, but what also is really important about, the way that the student is going to, be doing the real work of the institution, which is getting that degree, and you can focus on that. So when I'm collecting data at the University of Phoenix, I'm looking at retention rate, I'm looking at our course pass rates, and that's what I'm reporting on, how, our students with disabilities are doing compared to the rest of the institution, and then I'm talking about the effectiveness of our accommodations in that sense as well. So everything that I do is kind of connected to the academics. What I do is an academic endeavor, and so I feel pretty strongly that that's where we belong. And I saw Sean moved his mic, so he wants to.
Well, I think it's an excellent question, and I think we're at a wonderful opportunity. I think online learning is actually helping drive the part of the bus, if not driving the bus in this respect, and that is, over the years, and it's in variations, but some of our work in terms of accessibility in higher education came out of human resources, for lack of a better term, in that, well, we need to do this for employees, we'll do this for students as well, and then it evolved depending upon the campus. But where I'm seeing a lot of initiatives going on right now is, well, we have these centers for teaching excellence, and the University of Kansas, it's Center for Teaching Excellence is what it's called, but it's basically helping all faculty redesign and rethink about how they do instruction. And by the way, at the University of Kansas, it also collaborates with the online instruction kind of, so together they're trying to improve instruction. Well, that's where, to me, the accessibility collaboration to say, well, wait a minute, when we're looking at designing instruction, which should be the driver of what's happening on campuses, if we bring in the accessibility group and then they collaborate from that perspective, well, then it's a redesign. Then it's thinking about the instruction for all. And that's where I think there's a lot of efforts going on, what I'm hearing nationally in that respect, that's potentially altering. And it's also going along with what we're doing a lot of happening nationally, and again, we're a case study at KU, and that is retention. A lot of universities are pushing retention. We get students in, we're losing them. That's a bad business model. How do we retain? Instruction generally is at the forefront of that. Access, design, and gosh, what a nice marriage for all of our students, particularly those struggling and those with disabilities.
So let's see if we can watch the, if I can find the mouse here, the last video of Aaron.
UMKC Online. What is accessibility? What digital formats cause issues for you as a student?
PDFs are really difficult for me to use because I'm incapable of highlighting things that I need to highlight on the computer. And I can't really I can't print those documents out and highlight them myself. I need to work solely on a digital format. So it would be better if everything was kind of in a Word document, because then I could highlight things. I could probably post notes within the document. It would just make it a whole lot easier.
What does access mean to you?
Access here at the university would basically mean being able to learn what I need to learn in the time frame that I need to learn it to complete my degree.
Well, since we have about 10 minutes left, are there any questions from the audience that they want to kind of raise? I mean, this has been, I think, certainly an eye-opening experience. Yep.
As we have this discussion about focusing on the needs of the user, I'm reminded that some of our faculty are in need of accommodations. And so we have to remember that the systems that they use, whether it's entering grades or whatever, And thank you. And going along with that idea, one of the powerful ideas I heard one time was that at some point or another, each one of us will be what we might be thinking of as them. You know, we will have some kind of a disability, maybe temporary, maybe permanent. But right now our director she fell, broke her wrist, she can't type. So she's learning about Dragon and she's learning a lot of those things. So as we think about who needs these things, it's each of us.
I just want to comment, you were so right on, and hopefully through today, people can be thinking of not only students and not only faculty, but staff as well. At all of our institutions, organizations, we've got to think more broadly across the enterprise. And I struggle with that a little bit because I know the focus with OLC is that teaching, learning, model. So it really does sort of focus on that, that piece, which might leave, let's say, some staff members out or whatever. But very broadly, staff members end up by creating, whether it's, documents, well, it could be a bunch of things that end up by getting uploaded onto websites that then students need to consume or then faculty need to consume. So we really need to be thinking about this in a much broader way. I'm so glad you brought that up.
There's a question over here.
I would be interested in going back to the question you posed about who pays for this. I know you mentioned state voc rehab, possibly some equipment, possibly not, but assuming the accommodations granted, what does that look like at your institutions?
So I think, the last couple words of your sentence there, what does that look like at your institutions, is probably each one of us is going to have a different answer. The one thing that I can tell you is that, the University of Phoenix had a complaint filed with the Office for Civil Rights in 2015, and we entered into a resolution agreement and, realized where we were not spending our resources wisely in terms of, looking at access and looking at accommodation, for students. And so there's been a number of things that have happened through that. And I know that there's some other, institutions in the room as well who have had similar experiences in trials by fire, where, you're like, oh, wait, we really did need to, figure this out. So we make it our point that, we will ensure that our web presences, the activities that we're doing in a digital space will be accessible as they're being designed. And we have a plan in place to retrofit and to, fix other issues, remediate other issues, on a cycle, as we're looking at different things within the university. Each one of our units have been asked to make sure that they set aside funding and time, and funding, kind of becomes this whole thing of time and resources and the equipment needed to do what needs to be done, but, to, plan for accessibility. So we have a new CIO, and, I've met with him, and, we've talked about what, is kind of the responsibility of IT in terms of design and, implementation. What is the responsibility of my team to come in and do an evaluation and, make recommendations for remediation, and then we kind of negotiate who has what cost. But ultimately, it all comes out of the university's pocket, and so we just have to negotiate that. We do not purchase software for students. Students are on their own when it comes to that, but if we do have a computer lab at one of our local campuses, we are responsible for ensuring that at least one of those stations is accessible. There are other things, and I've done this at other institutions as well, as we've been building computer labs. I've made recommendations of buying adjustable height tables instead of standard and tables for computer labs, because you never know when a student is going to come in using a scooter or a wheelchair and need to come up to one of those stations, and if the station that has been designed accessible is being used by another student, do we really want to go up to that student and say you got to move? I don't think that that's a really good way to do it. So let's design it universally from the get-go, and let's put all of those tables so that they can be adjustable, and making sure that you have cloud licenses. This has been one of the greatest things I think over the last 10 years, a lot of the software vendors have gone to cloud licenses. So it doesn't have to be one station that is equipped with the assistive technology. They can all be, because you just load in, log into the cloud license and be able to open up if it's, read and write or, some of the other Kurzweil or whatever. When it comes to the course design, we do all of our design through our Center for Teaching and Learning. And our instructional designers work with subject matter experts to design the courses that faculty then facilitate. So a lot of the considerations for, access at that point are built into, the design of the course. So if it's a video that we're using that we can't get captions from, the publisher, we then put captions, into the video, and we pay for that cost, and that usually comes out of the Center for Teaching and Learning. So it's going to depend on your institution and where to go with it. I have, an accommodations budget through my disability services office that covers a lot of the individual needs, and we'll talk a little bit more in my next session too about some of the strategies that you can help with that. But that's just kind of a basic, where does the cost belong? Well, it depends on how you guys are paying for it, generally. Yep.
And the one rule of thumb you might want to consider is if your institution provides anything to anyone, it has to be available to everyone. So Kelly was talking about, software. Well, if your institution provides it, let's say at a computer lab, you need to make sure that it's provided for everyone, regardless of ability. I see a lot of online learning entities that will provide, for the period of time that you're in the course, a laptop. Well, okay, there you go. So now you have someone who needs essentially computing access on hardware, and maybe they have even different needs or more needs than Aaron does. Now that's your responsibility to make sure that your institution pays for them to have that computing access in the same way as everybody else does. If you don't provide that, that's not your responsibility. If the responsibility at your institution is that everybody gets their own hardware, then you don't need to deal with that. If they get their own software, then you don't need to deal with that. But you've got to be thinking about where is it that you do provide things for any student. That's where you have to be flexible and be available very quickly to provide it to all the students, including those with disabilities.
And the other thing not to forget about, as we mentioned earlier, is that most likely the individual's coming to us with some sort of equipment they've used over the years. It's not all of a sudden they get to a university and realize, oops, I need a device. That generally is not the case. So that's one element. And then two, separate from online learning, prior to online learning, a number of Office of Disability Services, depending upon what they are at your university or your setting, have in the past, depending upon their level, potentially been very involved with that transition. I mentioned that again, only because we've seen, I've seen historically across the country, separate from the online learning, where we know an individual is going to come into this university and they're working with that child before they come into the university, or that student before they come into the university, with things like device supports, with things like accommodations and the like. And so that generally will give them a heads up, especially when it comes to devices they may need and or training for those devices, et cetera. So that's part of a package that's separate from online learning, but yet very helpful and critical when they transition into more of an online learning space.
And with that, I think we're going to have to kind of wrap up the panel. The panelists obviously are going to be talking later today. There's lots of opportunities to kind of talk about this in kind of social gatherings. So what we'll do is reconvene at 9:30 in here to hear Kelly's talk about some of these issues. What I'd like to do is both thank the panel and also thank Tori in particular, because she really went out of her way to kind of collect the video and do this. And I hope that she can thank Aaron for us, because it was really a very enlightening kind of opportunity to be able to hear some of these things, directly from a student. So with that, let's take a break and thank the panel and take a break.